Thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see you all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mara Bernstein. I'm the program director at Park Avenue Synagogue. And we're so thrilled to be partnering with Jewish Lives on another dialogue in the Reading Jewish Lives series. A little bit about Jewish Lives. Jewish Lives is a prize-winning series of biographies designed to explore the many facets of Jewish identity. And you may have been to a Jewish Lives program with Park Avenue Synagogue previously. Some of the titles that they've published include Spinoza, Henrietta Zold, Abraham, Golda Meir, and many more. They've published 73 titles so far. The Jewish Lives is a partnership of Yale University Press and the Leon D. Black Foundation. You can learn more at jewishlives.org. And if you want to purchase a copy of the book we'll be discussing tonight, The Many Lives of Anne Frank, you can do so at jewishlives.org and use the code all caps Anne Frank, one word, to receive 25% off for a limited time. It's my honor to introduce our author this evening, Ruth Franklin. Ruth is the author of the new Jewish Lives biography, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Her first book was A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, and it was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. She is also the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography, and her work appears in many publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, The New York Review of Books, and more. Thank you, Ruth, for being with us, and thank you to Rabbi Neil Zuckerman of Park Avenue Synagogue for moderating tonight. Hand it over to you.
Welcome, everybody. I'm actually going to turn it right over to Ruth, who will sort of open our conversation tonight with some thoughts about the book, and I think you might read from the book a little bit. And I just want to say, Ruth, and I was saying this before everybody came on, it's a real pleasure to welcome you. And I hope that by the time that we are finished in the hour, that if people haven't purchased this book, they will, because whatever you think you know about the diary of Anne Frank, there's a lot to be learned from reading this book, and just it's an extraordinary book, and really happy to be in dialogue with you, Ruth. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Zuckerman, for hosting me here tonight. Thank you, Mara, for that wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you virtually, talking about this book, into which I really have poured my heart and soul for the last several years while working on it. And so, many people ask, why do we need another book about Anne Frank? What does this have to contribute? And, I want to start by saying that the diary, as for so many of us, the diary was a touchstone text for me. I read it growing up. I visited the Anne Frank house. As for so many American Jewish girls, women around the world, the book was important to me. But it wasn't until I became a little bit older and started learning a little bit more about the complicated history of its publication and reception that I really wanted to dive in and learn more. In the 90s, early 2000s, I started to hear and read news stories about how, for instance, missing pages from the diary had been discovered, or that there were these different versions of the diary that were out there, if not exactly published, that existed. And I wanted to understand more, because that was not the way this book was presented to me, or I think to any of us who read it, certainly in those decades, from the early 50s when it was published in America right up through the early 2000s. The diary was presented quite simply as a diary, and we weren't encouraged to ask questions about what Anne had intended when writing it. Did she want it to be published? The idea that she had rewritten the book from the beginning with an eye towards publishing it as a Holocaust testimonial was not part of the conversation back then. And so it felt really important to me that readers of this book, if you take anything else away from this conversation tonight, I hope it will be that Anne Frank deliberately rewrote her diary. She wrote her diary as a conventional diary, but the book we know is not that. It is a revision, more like a memoir in diary form, that she wrote as an intentional testimony, intending to tell the world about her persecution, and of course that of the other Jews in hiding with her in the Netherlands in general, their persecution by the Nazis. She wanted the world to know that story. And of course, that's what her book succeeded so brilliantly in doing. At the same time, as the decades have gone on, Anne Frank has only become more iconic. Her face is literally on billboards, like the one that I chose for the cover of this book. This is actually a piece of graffiti art done in New Haven, Connecticut, of all places, that the artist was kind enough to donate for this book as his own contribution to the global fight against anti-Semitism at this moment. So I want to publicly acknowledge him for that. Her face is on billboards. There's sculptures of her around the world. Her diary has inspired films, operas, ballets, you name it. And it struck me that the more iconic a figure like Anne Frank becomes, the farther removed we are from who she was as a human being. And as a biographer, that is what my work is about, to get as close as possible inside another person's head, to see the world from their perspective, to understand to the greatest extent possible their thoughts and feelings. And so that is what I aim to do in this book. I wanted to put those two things together. On the one hand, to restore Anne as a human being rather than an icon, to bring her back down to earth as an ordinary teenager who found herself under absolutely extraordinary circumstances and who made from them this incomparable book that has gone on to affect millions and millions of people around the world. And at the same time, I wanted to try to understand what happened when she became an icon, how her image has been used throughout the years, how it's been interpreted and misinterpreted in the many adaptations of her diary, in the fictionalization of her as a character in other people's novels and short stories, and of course, in the political arena, where she's evoked so often in the service of causes that she had absolutely nothing to do with. So the aim of my book, again, was to bring together those two elements of Anne Frank, the real human being and the icon. And in fact, my book is divided into two parts. The first part is a biography. It's not a conventional biography because Anne Frank is a very unconventional figure to write a biography about. But the first part of the book is a biography, and that part is called Anne Frank. And the second half of the book is more of a cultural history about the idea of Anne Frank and all the ways in which it's changed and developed in the decades since her diary was published. And that section of the book is called Anne Frank in quotation marks, because we're so far removed from who she is. So just to give you a little taste of the style in which some parts of this book are written, I'm going to read a scene from early on. This describes the event that triggered the Franks going into hiding. So I realized I jumped into the story. I assumed that just about everybody here must know the story of Anne Frank. But of course, she was in hiding with her family and with another family who were acquaintances of her father, and with a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer. They were 8 people total in hiding in a building now known as the Annex, which had been her father's workplace. They went into hiding in July 1942 and were in hiding for 2 years and 1 month before most likely being betrayed by someone, no one still knows who, to the Nazis. Everybody there was arrested and deported to concentration camps. Anne and her sister Margot tragically died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen, and her father, Otto Frank, was the only one of the residents to survive. So I'm going to read a little section from the beginning of the book that describes what happened to make them go into hiding. July 5th, 1942, 3 p.m. The doorbell rings. Anne is expecting her new boyfriend, Hello Silverberg. They've already spent the morning together, sitting in the sun. The parks may now be off limits, but Anne's apartment has a balcony. Like her, Helle was born in Germany. His real name is Helmut, but he's been living in Amsterdam with his grandparents since 1938, after his father's clothing store was destroyed during Kristallnacht. He's 16, and at first he preferred Margot, but she was completely unapproachable. When he met Anne at a friend's house, she made an impression on him, despite being 3 years younger. Quickly, he became fascinated with her. The two of them have been going out only for a week or so, but they've spent a lot of time together. He walks her to the Jewish Lyceum in the mornings. After school, they go to the Oasis ice cream parlor or hang out at each other's homes. They speak Dutch together, not German. He loves to hear her talk. She asks him about his family, how he came to the Netherlands, what happened to his parents. They fled to Belgium. He's had barely any contact with them for 4 years. His grandmother thinks Anne is too young for him, but he doesn't care. Like many Jewish teenagers in their circles, he also goes to meetings of a Zionist club. His grandparents don't approve of that either, so he's used to asserting himself. Perhaps this is part of what Anne finds attractive in him. Or perhaps it's just that he's older and clearly interested in her. But it's not hello at the door. A man's voice calls, "Miss Margot Franke." Edith goes down to answer. The man gives her an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. At the top, in large capital letters, it reads, "Summons. You are hereby ordered to participate in the police-supervised work relief program currently taking place in Germany, and are therefore to appear on July 15th, 1942, at 1:50 a.m. at Amsterdam Central Station. The following may be taken as baggage: 1 valise or rucksack, 1 pair of work boots, 2 pairs of stockings, 2 pairs of underpants, 1 pair of overalls, 2 sets of bedclothes, 1 bowl, 1 drinking cup, 1 spoon, and 1 cardigan. Should you fail to give heed to this summons, you will be punished with measures to be taken by the Sicherheitspolizei." Impossible to imagine what goes through Edith's mind at this moment. Otto is out visiting residents at a home for elderly and indigent Jews. Edith leaves the girls together in the apartment and returns with Mr. Van Pels. Anne is told that the summons is for Otto, not Margot. Considering how close Anne is to her father, it's not clear why Edith thinks she'll find this less frightening. The doors are locked. The Franks prepare to go into hiding immediately. Anne finds an excuse to drop off a few things with the neighbor's daughter: a book, a tin of marbles, a tea set. She will not say goodbye to hello. Now I'm going to skip ahead just a tiny bit to what happens on that night of the call-up notice. Between midnight and 2 in the morning on July 15th, under a moonless sky, tram cars brought the deportees to Amsterdam Central Station. They clattered through the sleeping city, heading northeast from the quiet streets of the river district across the Amstel River before zigging back towards the old town, where the windows of the royal palace were dark. Across from the station, they might have raised their eyes for a last glimpse of the medieval Schreierstorm, a barrel-shaped brick defense tower with a sharply pitched roof. It was the site from which countless Netherlanders, Henry Hudson among them, set out to sea, leaving their homes forever. The first train, run, like the others, by Dutch Railways, left at 2:16 a.m. Another followed 20 minutes later. Altogether, 962 people reported for deportation. The Nazis made up the difference with detainees from Westerbork en route from Amsterdam to Auschwitz. But historian wrote that henceforth the inmates in that camp went in fear and trembling lest Amsterdam failed them again in this matter. Heinz Geiringer, one of Margot's classmates, took comfort in the fact that she and 2 of his other friends had also been called. "I'm sure the Nazis will not harm me if I work hard," he told his mother. But Margot did not present herself at the station. Her place on the train would be filled by someone else, someone whose name remains unknown. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for those selections and for setting the stage for the book. I want to dig into some of the points that you were raising, but before we do that, one of the things I enjoyed about the book, which you really set the stage in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation at the beginning of the book, and I'm wondering if you could just set the scene for us, right? What was the atmosphere in Amsterdam when the family went into hiding, when the Frank, and we know both from your writing and also from other documentaries how the Franks Otto was really pursuing immigration to America, right? And if you just talk a little bit about that, and before you do, I want to encourage people, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them as often as we can. All right. So, Ruth, a little bit about Amsterdam. I want to get into the distinctions you are making with the versions of the book.
Yeah. So, as I sort of alluded to, but didn't explain, the Franks were actually German Jews. They came from Frankfurt, and they fled to the Netherlands as refugees in 1934, when Anne was only 4 years old after Hitler came to power. And, they chose Amsterdam. I alluded in that passage I mentioned, a Zionist club, of course, that immigrating to what was then known as Palestine was an option for some Jews at this time. But the Franks, like so many other Western European Jews, had considered themselves German. Otto came from a very assimilated family. He was deeply involved in German culture, identified strongly with German culture. He even served as an officer in the German army in World War I, and he believed that they belonged in Western Europe and that they would be safe there. And so Amsterdam seemed like the best bet for them. Also because he had a business opportunity there to open up a branch of this pectin distributing company that would ultimately be the place that the family hid. So of course, they had some happy years there, and then the atmosphere in Amsterdam started to become more and more filled with German Jewish refugees. This neighborhood where they lived in South Amsterdam, called the River District, was kind of a headquarters for those refugees. It was sort of like a little Germany, and they would all gather to share news about what was going on in Germany and to talk about the prospects for the future. And so we know, of course, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands in May 1940. And it's clear, that anybody who had been following the situation at all knew that, now was the time to get out. Of course, if it wasn't too late already. And Otto had applied for a visa to come to the U.S. as early as 1938 or 1939. All the records were destroyed in the Nazi bombing of the Netherlands, so we don't know for sure. But he renewed his application in 1941. And this is actually a fascinating story. The records of his correspondence with the refugee services and also with his friend Nathan Strauss, who was the heir to the Macy's fortune and also a high-up official in the Roosevelt government at the time. Otto and Nathan Strauss got to know each other when Strauss was studying abroad in Germany, actually during college, and they were best friends from those days. And there's a whole correspondence between them that was discovered in the early 2000s by a researcher at YIVO, who happened to be going through the file and saw Otto Frank's name on it and realized what these documents were about. And they trace Otto's increasingly desperate efforts to try to get the family out of the Netherlands in 1941. And it's really a heartbreaking story to read. He gets so close, and he's trying in the end to get a visa via Cuba, which was an option for some Jews at that point. They actually have the visa, and then it gets canceled when Pearl Harbor takes place and the U.S. enters the war, and all communication with Europe is cut off. So that's just one of the many tragic and poignant details of the story, is how close they potentially came to being able to take refuge in the United States.
Yeah. So thank you. Somebody just put in the chat the question of which version of the diary of the book should they read. And I want to, it's actually a great transition to drill down on what you were talking about. You mentioned that for many of us, we were introduced to this book as as young adults, right? Of reading about Anne Frank. We knew who Anne Frank was. What I learned and what I wasn't aware of to the degree is the evolution that this book went through, this diary went through. And you touched on it a little bit in your introductory remarks of Anne essentially rewriting the diary. Of course, there's a context for why she does that. So I'm wondering, for those who are looking up versions of the Anne Frank diary right now, you're not going to find, I don't believe, Ruth, unless you tell me, in print, the different volumes or the different, versions of this. So maybe you could walk us through, I think in the book you identify 4 different versions of the diary, and maybe just help us understand the sort of genesis of those versions / evolution, and how we ended up where we are today with the book that you can order or buy in a bookstore.
Well, it's a complicated but a fascinating story. And so the background of this is that over the years, periodically, the diary has been accused of being a forgery. There's people have said that it's made up, that they've said that Otto wrote it himself, any kind of Holocaust revisionist lie you can think of has been levied at the diary. Then this still persists to this day. Something that you sometimes see Holocaust revisionists saying is that the diary was written in ballpoint pen, which I won't even get into the conspiracy theory that is being evoked there, but it's not true. The Diary of Anne Frank is a real document. And in order to forever debunk this Holocaust denialism, the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, which is an important Holocaust research center in the Netherlands, undertook a forensic study of the diary. They decided that, they're going to analyze the paper and the ink and Anne's handwriting and prove once and for all this book is not a forgery. And they published their results in a big book called The Diary of Anne Frank, the Critical Edition. And since we're here in my home office, I can actually show you this book.
Yeah.
And what they revealed in this book was that the diary existed at that point in 3 different versions. There's what they call version A, which is the rough draft, the diary that Anne wrote, contemporaneously as she's living her life. Some of you may be familiar with the idea, with the image of the little red checked diary that Anne received for her 13th birthday. That's the first volume of this. And then she continued it in various notebooks, whatever paper she got a hold of, she continued writing this diary. And then at the end of March 1944, she and the other residents of the annex were listening to the clandestine news on the radio in the evening, as they often did. And they heard a minister from the Dutch government in exile give a speech in which he called for citizens to preserve their documents, their private papers from the war years, for a future national archive that was going to tell everyone the sufferings that they had experienced during this time. And he gave this very moving speech where he said that history can't be written on the basis of public documents alone, that we need private papers like diaries and letters for people to have a full understanding of what we as a nation experienced during these years. And Anne and the other residents heard this, and she writes in her diary, they all made a rush at my diary. They knew that she had just such a document that this minister was talking about on the radio. But it's clear that as she looked back over it over the next couple of months, she realized that the diary as she had written it didn't quite serve the purpose that it would need to in order to be of use in that kind of national archive. She had written it as a private diary. She had written it for herself. And it was full of all kinds of things like gossip about her classmates and daydreams about becoming a Hollywood star and all sorts of things that had nothing to do with what was going on around her. And she went back to the beginning. She took new sheets of paper and she started writing it again. And what she wrote on those new sheets, they're called the loose sheets, and this is called version B. Her own edit of the diary is version B. She took out those personal elements and she added more context, more information, more about the Nazis. You know, there are moments in the beginning, for instance, where she talks about, as I alluded to in the little passage that I read, she talks about hanging out at the Oasis ice cream parlor with her friends. Well, what she doesn't mention in her first draft, but that she puts into the second draft, is the detail that the reason they're hanging out at this ice cream parlor is that it's one of the only ones where Jews are allowed to go. And little by little, she adds in those details that show exactly what was happening to her. And, you know, we can say that maybe, you know, at the beginning of the diary, she's only 13, right? By the time that she's revising it at the end, she's almost 15. She's been in hiding for 2 years, almost 2 years. She's experienced so much. She understands the world so much better. She understands what happened to her. And it's important to her that that story get passed on. And there's one tiny change that she makes that I think is so emblematic of this project. And there's it's in this entry where she's telling the story of hearing this Dutch minister on the radio. And she says, wouldn't it be funny if 10 years from now, people were to read about what we ate and did and how we lived here? And that's version A. And then in version B, she makes a tiny change. She writes, wouldn't it be funny if we Jews were to tell what we did and talked about and how we lived here? And I think that's really the essence. She understood that the story of the Holocaust had to be told by the people who experienced it, that others would not be able to tell the story in the same way. And that's the story that she undertook to tell. So, okay, that's her version B. So you can ask, why didn't her father just publish this version? Okay, so, and I noticed I'm not actually looking at the chat, but I noticed something popped up about that, a question, I think, about how do we have these versions in the first place? Right. And so the story there is when the Nazis raided the annex on August 4th, 1944, the Gestapo officer who was in charge of the raid wanted a place to put whatever, meager valuables they still had left there. And his eye fell on the briefcase that Anne used to keep her papers in. And he picked it up and he dumped out everything on the floor and he took away whatever valuables they had in this briefcase. And what he dumped out on the floor was Anne's diary in all these different versions. And after the residents had been arrested, two of Otto's employees, two former secretaries named Miep, who's very famous, Miep Fries, whose name you may know, and also Beb Voskuil, whose name is less well known, but who is actually Anne's closest friend among the helpers and her closest confidant during those years in the annex. They went back up to the annex to see if there was anything left to be salvaged, and what they found was Anne's diary on the floor. And they recognized it because everybody knew that Anne had done all this writing. It was so important to her. And not only did they see her doing it, but she used to read aloud from it. She read passages from the diary to Miep and Bep and to her sister and to others who are interested in hearing her writing. And so Miep gathered up all these pages and put them in her desk and decided to save them in the hope that Anne would come back for them. And when it was conclusively determined that Anne and Margot had both died in Bergen-Belsen, Miep gave these papers to Otto. And she said to him, "This is your daughter's legacy to you." So, okay, why didn't he just publish the diary the way Anne had written it? Well, for one thing, she didn't finish it. She had gotten up, within a few months of the date where she was, but she hadn't finished her revision. But the second, I think the real reason is that Anne had actually taken out things that Otto thought should be left in. And the foremost among them is her relationship with Peter Van Pels, right? Anybody who's read the diary remembers that Anne had this sweet romance, this experience of first love with Peter Van Pels, the boy, the son of the other family with whom they were in hiding. And when she revised the diary, she took all of that out. There's a point in early 1944 where she's writing about Peter just about every single day. The ups and downs. Did he look at her? What did he talk to her? What happened? Their first kiss, every single day. And she took all of that out, and we can only speculate about why. Did it seem too personal? Did it detract from what she saw as her diary's value as a testimony to have all this romance? We don't know why. Just like we don't know why Otto decided to put it back in, because he never spoke in public. He never spoke on the record about the edits he made to the diary, because at the time that he died, nobody knew about that. Nobody knew that there were these different versions to ask him. And so he made his own version, and that's now known as version C. And that's the version that probably all of us grew up reading. If you read the Diary of Anne Frank if you read it in English before 1995 or so, you read version C, the version that Otto pieced together out of Anne's edit and some of the original material that he wanted to reinstate. So that's the rundown there.
So it's amazing detective work, and we'll come back a little bit later to talk about the archival work, which I'm always fascinated about when talking to authors. I want to stay on Otto for a second, because in the book you go into great detail, and I'm looking at the section right now about working with the people at Doubleday, and I'm blanking on her first name. Last name is Zimmerman.
Barbara Zimmerman.
Barbara Zimmerman. It's interesting just to reflect for a few minutes, Ruth, about the ways in which Otto shaped, you say this, that Otto Frank shaped the diary into a document that would be palatable to a wide audience. And I'm just going to read a few lines from the book. The first sign that the book might be something unusual came when the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt agreed to provide an introduction, which Zimmerman drafted and Roosevelt accepted verbatim. It emphasizes the diary's uplifting and universal qualities. The word Jew does not appear. This is the beginning, I think, at least in the conversation that you're having in this book, about the way in which the book becomes more universal than particular. And I think we'll come back to that question, the dangers of universalizing, this book. Can you say a little bit more about Otto's editorial decisions, and then maybe that can lead you into what I think is another fascinating chapter of this story, and that is the ways in which the book is adapted to become a Broadway play. And maybe you could walk us through that process. What got lost or changed in that process that further perhaps even diluted the primary message of this diary?
Sure. Well, yeah, as you say, it all revolves around the central tension between the universal meaning of the diary as, a document for all humanity, and the particular meaning of as a document about anti-Semitism. And so, I'll just start by saying that I think Otto Frank has truly been quite unfairly demonized in the story of the publication of Anne's diary. If people know anything about his role, there's a perception that he censored her words, he censored her criticisms of her mother, he censored her thoughts about her sexuality. And I was just fascinated to discover that none of this is true. And I'll just say briefly that, as I talked about having read the diary as a child, but it is a different experience to read the diary as an adult. And I'll say especially as a parent. I'm a mother of 3 kids, one of whom was age 13, the age that Anne was when she received the diary, when I started working on this book. And I think reading the diary from that perspective gives you just such a profound amount of sympathy for Otto Frank and the unbelievably painful position that he must have found himself in, that he was the only survivor of these 8, the only survivor of his family. He waited, in the hope that his daughters would return, having known that his wife died in Auschwitz. He held out the hope that his daughters would come back. And then he found out that they had died, and he was given this extraordinary gift of his daughter's diary. And it seems, from the beginning that he recognized what an amazing document it was and the good that it had power to do in the world. And he said right from the start that, that he wanted it to be understood, that he thought its message should be understood in the broadest possible sense so that it could work against prejudice writ large, prejudice understood in the most general way. And so he was, part of, certainly, he was an enthusiastic participant in the American publisher Doubleday's campaign to present this book as not a Jewish book. As you pointed out, the introduction from Eleanor Roosevelt, in which the word Jew does not appear. There was also an extraordinary review in the New York Times Book Review that really launched the diary as a bestseller, in which the author of that review describes it as a book of the most complete universalism. He talks about Anne's adolescent love story. He says that the Franks could be any family, any of our neighbors, the family living down the street. They're just like anyone else. And it's particularly extraordinary to read those words knowing that the author of them was Meyer Levin, who, some of those in the audience may know that he became embroiled eventually in a lawsuit against Otto Frank over the right to adapt the diary for Broadway, which he brought against Otto because he became enraged by the fact that the diary was given to a non-Jewish husband and wife screenwriting pair, the Hackett's, Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett, rather than himself. And he and Otto had a protracted argument that went on for years, if not decades, over the extent to which the diary should be adapted as a Jewish text. And there's one amazing letter in which Otto writes to Levin. He says, "It's not a Jewish book, so do not make a Jewish play out of it." Right? The Diary of Anne Frank, not a Jewish book. But at the same time, in the very same letter, he says, but at the same time, it must be a Jewish play so that it can work against anti-Semitism. I think, and that is just the fatal catch-22 that the diary has kind of found itself caught in ever since. And on some level, it is not a Jewish book. It is embraced by people around the world. It doesn't have to be understood in the context of the Holocaust for people to find it meaningful. And in the course of researching this book, I found myself collecting various stories of all kinds of people who were affected by the diary in what I found to be, fascinating and profound ways, from, a refugee from Eritrea who reads the diary in an Ethiopian refugee camp and decides to translate it into his native tribal Eritrean language, to the Japanese in the wake of Hiroshima, who made the diary a bestseller, in part, it seems, because it was the first book in Japanese to discuss menstruation, and that they became attached to Anne as this kind of symbol of young womanhood, to anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, including Nelson Mandela, who read the diary while they were in prison on Robben Island and found inspiration in it. And I think, this is part of what makes the diary such an important book and so powerful, is that it has this ability to speak to people around the world in all kinds of different contexts. At the same time, I, for one, am not quite ready to say that it's not a Jewish book, right? I think Otto Frank is exactly right, where he says, well, wait a minute, if it's not a Jewish book, it has to be a Jewish book so that it can work against anti-Semitism. And I think, and there are some cases, some of which I go into in the book, in which we get, very far afield from its original meaning.
So I want to put a pin in that, Ruth. I'm going to come back to that. You've made a case for, the universal uses of this book, and you really go into great detail on that in the book, and it's powerful. I want to come back to what you see as sort of the misuse of Anne Frank. But before we do that, I want to stay on this. I want to stay on the play for a moment, because the ways in which much of Anne's Jewishness is cut from the play, or they universalize her story. There's a context in which this is happening, right? American Jews at the time. What's interesting is, I think, if I'm correct, that the debut of this play was in 1955. 9 years later, Fiddler on the Roof debuts on Broadway, which is unapologetically
definitely a Jewish play,
right? And so I'm just what's happening, in the Jewish world in the 1950s, that Levin can say this is definitively not a Jewish book, right? Or are Jews comfortable? Are they uncomfortable with the over sort of emphasizing the Jewishness of a story like Anne Frank? Any thoughts about that? Or
yeah, I mean, my own sense of it is that there was this enormous level of anxiety, among American Jews, also, of course, among Holocaust survivors like Otto Frank, about, being openly Jewish. And, there's a whole other story about Otto's return to Amsterdam and how difficult the situation was for the very, very few, the very small minority of Dutch Jews who survived and managed to come back. And who were treated quite poorly by the Dutch government, of course, and many of them wound up leaving the Netherlands, some for Israel, some elsewhere. I think there was truly a sense in which, they had seen quite definitively how dangerous it was for them to stand out as Jews, for them to be identified as Jews. But, we talked about Otto the Franks as, this deeply assimilated family who believed that they blended into their society, and then were, so painfully disabused of that idea. And I think that among American Jews, that anxiety of that at that moment, the late 40s and early 50s, that anxiety about standing out is really palpable.
People should read this part of the book. I think it's an extraordinary part, as you're speaking about this evolution. And again, in particular, I just found the sections around the production of the Broadway play to be just fascinating.
And so many of these figures are Jewish also.
Exactly.
The producer is Jewish. The director is Jewish. It's not like the play is being de-Judaized by a bunch of non-Jews.
Correct. And it's being performed in New York City. So it's, okay. Let's come back to the point you were making before this, because as much as you argue persuasively, I think, for the power of Anne as a symbol, as an icon for the various groups that you mentioned, I think there's also a case, and you make the case, about what gets lost when Anne Frank becomes just some generic symbol of human resilience, rather than the specific story of a young Jewish girl murdered in the Holocaust. So what? Just give me the flip side of the case you were making before about the dangers of over universalizing the story of Anne Frank.
So yeah, I mean, there are, in many cases, I'm reluctant to say, like, this is bad. This is a wrong use. I certainly don't see myself as the Anne Frank police, as, the determiner of what's okay and what's not okay. And I think, one thing that I think is truly amazing is the way And I profile a couple of artists, a number of artists in the book who are inspired by the diary to create really unusual and striking works of art that are loosely based on it. But okay, all that to say, I think there's a danger when we talk about the diary, about needing to update the diary to make it relevant to today's audiences. And that's something that we find in some of the works that are based on it. There's a film by Ari Folman, who also has a wonderful graphic adaptation of the diary. He made a film called Where is Anne Frank that sort of oddly has never been distributed in the U.S., but it's available in a graphic novel form, and it's available elsewhere in the world, in which he imagines the figure of Kitty, the addressee of the diary, coming to life in modern day Amsterdam and wandering around the city searching for her beloved friend Anne. And what she finds, she says, is a society that hasn't internalized Anne's lessons, that hasn't learned anything from the Holocaust. And she sees an example of this in the way that migrants from the Middle East are being treated. And they are sort of explicitly brought up in this movie, then the book that goes with it, as this, this is the version of Anne Frank today. And we see that, in various places. There is a column by Nick Kristof of the New York Times written in 2016 during the Syrian refugee crisis, where he says Anne Frank today is a Syrian girl. And, I think, I, for one, certainly feel the parallels between the situation of the Franks, what we are talking about there. So their struggle to get visas, their desperate desire to emigrate. You can see the parallel between that and what's going on now in terms of the persecution of migrants in this country, the random deportations that are starting to happen, around us in New York City and elsewhere now. But I think that we can recognize those parallels and also remember that Anne Frank is still Anne Frank. She doesn't have to be a Syrian girl in order to still be relevant now. I will say also that, in light of the violence that was perpetrated against Jews in Amsterdam a few months ago, last November, largely by Arab immigrants to the city, I think it's quite ironic in that light to compare Anne's situation to the Syrian refugee crisis.
In some ways, it's another expression of Judaicizing Anne, right? In other words, she can't just be a Jewish girl suffering, right? It's got to be universalized so that we can apply it to the Syrian refugee. It's right, because if she's a Jew, then somehow I almost feel like they can't quite make that connection. Right?
Well, then what you're putting your finger on there is that's anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
that is an act. It's an act of anti-Semitism, not to be able to look at a Jewish girl and say, "I'm like her." She's
right. You bring my favorite example in the book of this. Roger Waters, of Pink Floyd, projecting Anne Frank's name and image onto a gigantic screen and juxtapose it with the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot by the IDF. Right, so it's just an unnecessary almost that journalist. We can acknowledge that tragedy without sort of linking it necessarily to Anne Frank. At least that's my read. But it's another powerful section of the book. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to just there are two particular things I want to focus on.
Looks like we have a lot of questions.
Yeah,
too.
I think we covered some of them. Some of them I don't know if.
Yeah. But
someone asks a couple times about Otto taking out the negative things she had written about her mother.
Yeah, mostly he didn't.
Yeah. You mentioned that before. So someone brings up didn't they also distort the book by ending the play with and the movie with Anne's comment about people being essentially good? I don't know whether that's it. I don't know what the editorial decision was to end it there, but But let's stay on that quote for a second. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I think that's the exact quote.
Yes.
How would you, I mean, I'm in the same way I wasn't asking you to referee the usage of Anne Frank's, as someone who has spent a lot of time in this work, how would you interpret that line now? Right.
Well, like everything, it's a little more complicated than it initially appears. And, I'm looking now, of course, I can't instantly find it, but that quote, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. In context, in the diary, comes in the midst of a long passage in which Anne is also talking about the depredations of war. She says, I feel the thunder approaching. I'm worried that it's going to engulf us all. And so, it's often, so first of all, the quote is often taken out of context. But, over the course of researching this book, thinking about Anne so deeply and trying to understand what she may have meant, I came to see that quote in a somewhat different way. And it was also those anti-apartheid activists that led me there. There's one of the prisoners, Ahmed Kathrada, kept a notebook in which he actually copied out passages from the diary into his own notebook while he was in prison. And that passage about people being good at heart, but also the rest of it, the thunder approaching, how he said, she says, I feel the suffering of millions. He included the rest of it too. And it struck me in that context that, if you're somebody like that, if you're, an activist trying to rebuild your government, rebuild your nation, it's a revolutionary statement to believe that people are still good at heart in light of everything that these people experienced. But it's also necessary, right? That if you're trying to rebuild your society, you're trying to create a new system, a democratic system where there's been apartheid, you have to believe that people are good at heart. Otherwise there's only ever going to be tyranny. And so, I think Anne has kind of been disparaged for this quote. A lot of critics have said that, it's the naive cry of a child. There are others, Holocaust scholars, who have said that if she had lived to survive the concentration camps, she would not have made that statement. My own position is that we can't know, and we cannot speculate about what a surviving Anne might have believed or not. And certainly there are people who suffered a lot in this world who still believe in the goodness of humanity. And it's quite possible that Anne Frank also would have been such a thinker.
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking about those who emerged from the camps or subsequently spent time in the DP camps and went on to create a nation. I mean,
yeah, right.
So I agree with you, and I've often felt that I've known that quote was taken out of context, and B, anybody who's a person of faith and who lives in the real world would probably say something similar, maybe not exactly that phrase, but if you wake up in the morning and work to improve the world, you believe in the essential goodness of human beings, right? So,
I hope so, right? I mean, we didn't talk about Anne's spirituality at all, but that also is an important component of her thinking, and an important sustainer of her in the annex. I talk about it a little bit in the context that, again, in the context of Anne's Jewishness, it's complicated because, the extent to which she expresses a theology or a belief in God, it's not really conventionally Jewish. She has more of kind of a generically spiritual or almost like a pantheistic outlook on the world, where she, yearns to experience God as a part of nature. And again, it's quite poignant that that's what she's thinking about in the annex when she, doesn't have any connection with nature at all. That's what she longs for so much. But God was important to her, and in the way in which she understood there to be a God.
Yeah. So the book is titled "The Many Lives of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
What do you, yeah, hold it up. Everybody should order it. It's a great book. If you like this dialogue, you will really enjoy the book. So what do you hope that readers take away from the sort of true complexity of Anne's story?
I hope that they will appreciate her as a multi-dimensional human being. I mean, the reason it's called The Many Lives of Anne Frank is because the book is structured sort of in the context of Anne's many different identities, or, the different ways in which people have seen her. And it starts with her she's a child when she's growing up in Frankfurt, and she becomes a target of the Nazis, and eventually she's a prisoner in the camps. And then, later on, she's, in the afterlife part, I see her as an ambassador of her message to the world. And, and the last chapter, which is about Anne in the political arena, is called Pawn. Pawn, because that's how I came to see the way that she is seen by many activists who, simply recruit her to their cause without a sense of who she was historically and what she stood for. And so, my hope is that readers will deepen their sense of who she was and what she stood for. She has become an icon. She's touched so many people. But I think the vast majority of her readers don't know that much about her life, about her historical context, about the Holocaust in the Netherlands, which we didn't really get into, but that also is a fascinating historical story. The Holocaust unfolded in the Netherlands in a very different way than it did in Eastern Europe, or the Soviet Union, for instance. And yeah, so I hope that this book will enrich people's reading of the diary and their understanding of who Anne was.
All right, one last question for you. You spent years, I don't know how you could even quantify the hours living with Anne Frank. All of your research, is there a moment from the diary or a line in the diary that continues to stay with you?
Wow, there are so many. It's so hard to say. I will say she really did become very vivid to me. But just today, I was going through a whole pile of old papers, and one of the papers I stopped to look at had on it a whole list of possible titles that I considered at one point for this book. They're all, my agent had told me to pull out all of my favorite quotes from the diary in the hope that we might be able to use one of them as the title. And the one that I really wish that we could have used, I mean, I'm happy with the title. Nobody at Yale should be listening to this and thinking, but, there was one quote where she says, "Let me be myself." And I felt that really encapsulated a lot of what I was trying to communicate about her, and the way she saw herself in the world. And that's the one that comes back to me.
So in that spirit, Ruth, I'll close with the last words of your book, which I think are beautiful. From the refugee camps of Ethiopia to the towers of Tokyo, the prisons of South Africa to the farms of the American South, Anne Frank has served as friend, inspiration, and truth teller to millions. Let's remember her also as a teenager behind a locked door, pen and paper at the ready, watchful, indomitable, alive. Ruth, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. This is the book, all right? The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Really extraordinary. Ruth, I want to wish you Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a happy, a sweet Passover with you and your family. Thank you for being with us tonight. And I want to wish everyone the same. And have a good night. Mara Bernstein, thank you for coordinating and facilitating this. And we'll see you soon. All right. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. And likewise, Chag Sameach, thanks so much for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
You too. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.